What I want to do is to speak about history, and both Chinese history and African history and global history. Try to run a thread through these three things to try to understand better how did we arrive at the present moment in terms of Africa's relations with the rest of the world, and I think there's a particular interest in Africa's relations with China, but that's not the only thing we'll discuss here today. In my book, China's Second Continent, which, as I said, came out in 2014, I explored the terrain of a very large number of Chinese recent migrants to Africa in a variety of countries across the continent. And I looked at these communities in all of the different cardinal directions of Africa, so in some northern African places and some eastern, western, and southern African places. And one of the main impulses, or I guess sources of interest from the publishers, I had done a little bit of magazine work on this topic before the book was done, but a little of the interest, I think some of the standing public interest in this topic was really based on some very widespread and deeply held stereotypes about what is going on between China and Africa. And insofar as migrants are concerned, the most important stereotypes I'd like to just sort of dispel right from the outset. And these were easily disproven in the earliest phases of research for this book, and I wouldn't dwell on them except for the fact that they are so persistent. I think they need to be addressed right off of the top. The first of these is the influx of recent Chinese arrivals in various African countries and of Chinese economic activity at the individual and small entrepreneur level is something that is driven at a high level by the Chinese state. That is very easily disproven. That's not the case. There was no sort of master plan by the Chinese state to move lots of people to Africa. It took a very short time in a small number of countries traveling around doing the research for this book to understand how it was that Chinese people started to arrive in Western African countries initially, and in Zambia also. It had almost nothing to do with any sort of high-end Chinese national government kind of directive. Actually, nothing to do with the directive. It did have something to do with state company contracts, but this was not by design. The second point is that there had been this idea that China wanted to get its hands on African resources, and therefore it was rushing into resource-rich countries, and that migrants were following. This is pretty easily disproven. You will discover very quickly, as I did, and as I wrote about, that there are Chinese people everywhere. That recent Chinese migrants, these populations that are the topic of this book, have been established in all kinds of African countries. Big countries, small countries, resource-rich countries, primary product and agricultural type economies, what have you. And I opened the book in Mozambique, where the most colorful character that I encountered in a year of sort of territorial exploration of the terrain is what I'd meant to say. And this guy was, Hao Shangli was the name of the character, and he was just one of the most kind of rugged, salt-of-the-earth, pithy, kind of no-nonsense people you could ever meet. And I went on a very long drive with him from Maputo to his farm in sort of north-central Mozambique. And this was an unforgettable drive, and we had never met before. He had offered he came to Maputo to meet me, never met me before, and offered to drive me to his farm. I met him online. And we spoke Chinese throughout the trip, and he had just one incredible thing to say after another. And I won't bore you with the long story, the details of the long story, but one of the most important things for me to establish was why he had chosen Mozambique. And that, in fact, the answer to that is a very interesting story, and you'll have to buy the book to get that, I'm afraid. And he said, first of all, there's no such a thing, that there are Chinese people in every African country. But just imagine if there were a place where there's no Chinese people, that means that's a place, I thought he was going to say that's a place where it's very dangerous. That's a place where there's war or mayhem or disease or epidemic or whatever. He said it wasn't that at all. He said, if there were such a place, that would mean that in that place it was impossible to do business. And that said a lot to me, that Chinese people in this period are seeking business opportunities all over the world. And Africa, for very particular historic reasons, began in the early 1990s to become the kind of launching pad for this outward bound Chinese experience. Chinese people are, of course, everywhere in the world. There are recent Chinese migrants in large number for the first time in modern history, right? But this entire story begins in Africa in the early 1990s. And so in the first part of my talk, I'd like to sort of explain my understanding of the history behind why that is. Because first of all, I think it's a very interesting story. I think it's a poorly understood story. But I also think it is a helpful story for kind of situating us to understand better today's world and to kind of try to anticipate a little bit, which is what I expect to be perhaps one of the topics of conversation when we get into the question and answer period. Where are things going? What should one expect in the future from China, from Africa's engagement with the rest of the world, et cetera? So to tell this history in the way I think it should be told, I have to go back. I have to begin in the 1970s, and I'm going to give you a very rough and highly compressed sort of thumbnail account of the Chinese reform era. So, of course, in 1949, the communists come to power in China. Mao Zedong becomes the head of state after a victory in the civil war against the nationalists. And Mao rules until 1976. Mao dies in 1976. Up until that point, China had been a very, economically speaking, inwardly looking country. It had a very strong emphasis on self-reliance. It had not been in very active pursuit of world trade. It had not been a big manufacturing power at all. And it had, under Mao, a kind of vision of itself as a country that would prevail eventually by surviving. China, in Mao's view, had such a large population that it would survive no matter what. So Mao dies in 1976. Before Mao died, especially in the 1960s, but actually beginning even earlier than that, Mao had a very important lieutenant named Deng Xiaoping. And Deng, who later succeeded Mao, was this person who had shown a high degree of competency in a lot of different areas. He had been a very successful military leader. He had been a very successful party leader. He had shown a talent for economic organization and management, et cetera, et cetera. But Mao had this fear of Deng as somebody who, given a chance, would put China on what Mao liked to call the capitalist road. Now, Mao was a very paranoid person in many ways. The Mao period was one of constant campaigns and ritual kind of trials and hazings and internal exile and repression of people who he imagined to be ideological enemies. But with regard to Deng Xiaoping, Mao was not being paranoid. Mao died in 1976. And 2 or 3 years later, Deng consolidated his control over power in China, even though he was not the designated successor. And very soon thereafter begins to do what? Begins to put China on the capitalist road. So the capitalist road begins in a place that at the time, in the very early 1980s, was a fishing village called Shenzhen. And this place in southern China near Hong Kong was chosen by Deng as a place to begin a series of economic experiments. And Deng chose Shenzhen for a variety of reasons. Shenzhen was chosen because, partly because it was close to Hong Kong, and China was, on a per capita basis, in 1980, roughly about the same wealth as Bangladesh. So an extremely poor country on a per capita basis. And Hong Kong was a rich place. And Hong Kong was a Chinese city under British control, where there was lots of capital and where there was lots of economic expertise. And at that time, although not so much anymore, a lot of manufacturing. And so Deng had this idea that if I set up a place which we'll call a special economic zone on the southern edge of China near Hong Kong, I can attract economic expertise and capital from Chinese capitalists initially based in Hong Kong, and begin some experiments in modern economic production and management in my special economic zone. There was another reason why he chose Shenzhen, though, and that is because the rest of the ruling class of China did not like this idea at all. So the rest of the ruling class was consisted for the most part of people who Mao had put in power and who still bought into the Maoist kind of program of economic self-sufficiency and class warfare and an ideological commitment to socialism. And they all knew how suspicious Mao was of Deng on this basis that he would become a capitalist roader. And so Deng had to proceed very carefully. And so he said, well, if I'm going to try some experiments in capitalism, I have to put them in a far sort of out-of-the-way place at the edge, periphery of China, where I won't arouse too much suspicion, there won't be too much commotion, and the conservatives around me, conservatives meaning people who do not wish for change, won't become mobilized against me. And so Shenzhen, this tiny fishing village, is chosen, and China sets up this economic zone system. And it becomes normally I give a talk that lasts, I spend 45 minutes on this part, but I'm going to do this really quickly. So Shenzhen, for those of you who've been to Shenzhen, is like, it's sort of an extraordinary thing, even for those of us who have lived in China or who have spent lots of time in China. It's still hard to kind of completely deal with this fact. But Shenzhen started from nothing, a true village, and is now a global city of the first rank. I mean, it's just an extraordinary place. I have seen it, I have heard it said, I've seen it written, I have no idea how to measure this or what the nature of the source is, but it doesn't seem it doesn't seem outlandish that Shenzhen has more skyscrapers than New York City. So this all begins to happen in the 1980s. Deng succeeds in setting up the special economic zone in Shenzhen, the fishing village. He controls entry and access of Chinese people into it. Not any old job seeker can come there. That would have caused, if it had begun to succeed, a kind of run on the town. There would have been a kind of a chaos, right? And so it's very quietly managed, becomes very successful. And because it was so successful, and successful in some very important particular ways, successful in making money. China was very poor. China needed to make money. Successful B, in absorbing technology. So in this case, the main technology was manufacturing technology. China was starting out in modern industrialization, meaning the sort of very typical first rungs of manufacture, which are things like injection plastics and textiles, right? And so China absorbed this technology via the Hong Kong companies that wished to invest in this special economic zone. And by the way, they wanted to invest in the special economic zone because China had a highly educated, by the standards of the rest of the world, and disciplined workforce, which was willing to work, in fact, eager to work for very low wages. And so the Hong Kong capitalists said, we get disciplined workers who are well educated and we don't have to pay them much. Great, let's invest in Shenzhen and bring some of our manufacturing of plastics and textiles and simple electronics and things like that there to make them, and we can realize a higher profit rate, right? From the Chinese perspective, the mainland Chinese perspective, the idea was not just we'll make money, but we will absorb some of these new technologies. And so far I've spoken of what I'll call hard technologies, meaning, the nitty-gritty of manufacturing, but China also wanted to absorb what I'll call soft technologies, which means how to manage a modern enterprise in a capitalist mode of production. And so these these Hong Kong companies set up in Shenzhen, and they begin to manufacture at a very high pace, and this becomes an impressive success for Deng. And the resistance of the conservatives around him begins to fade, and China begins to proliferate special economic zones around the country. And I don't know ultimately, in fact, there are still special economic zones in China, but I don't know ultimately how many were made, but they begin to proliferate. Resistance goes away. China's opening and reform era, as it came to be called, begins to be perceived as a great success, and the rest is, as they say, history, right? China is now the manufacturing power that leads the world, and Chinese people on a per capita basis are no longer poor, and China has lots of cities, actually, that have subway systems and high-speed rails, et cetera, in a very short period of time, historically speaking. So I said the rest is history, but that's giving the details of what we need to talk about somewhat short shrift. And so I'm going to back up a little bit to go over a couple of items that I think have to be emphasized here. The first of them is that China has a political system which places a high value on planning. So China is a hybrid political system. It has a Communist Party, which is the sole and unique party that has any power in the country, and but it has a largely, yes, I'll say largely capitalist economy. And so you have this hybrid political system, political economy, but it retains even now a high degree of planning. And so we have to go back after this initial success in the special economic zones to talk about, I want to sort of bring this conversation to Africa very quickly and to understand how China and how Chinese people began to come to Africa gets into the topic of these planning discussions. And so in the 1980s, when the special economic zones had begun to thrive and were doing a booming business, and the political resistance against this in China faded away among the conservatives, China began having, as it routinely does, a series of conversations about what is the best path for us to pursue in the future. And so a series of conversations take place in a setting that a particular kind of political instance in China called leading small groups, which are members of the political elite who get together and they're assigned particular topics to deliberate on. And so some of them are economic groups, and they have planning discussions about economic strategy, et cetera. And from what I gather, the conversations in the late 1980s, or starting in the mid and culminating in the late 1980s, went something like this. That yes, it is true that the special economic zones have been an extraordinary success, but if we were only to stick to this approach to our economic development, we would be setting ourselves up for a big failure. That this giant success from the special economic zones, however seductive it may be, is a dead end for us. That special economic zones are by their very nature enclaves. They can only, by their very nature, because they are enclaves, employ a limited number of people, and therefore, however much money they're making, they can't really be the solution for the vast hinterland of the Chinese labor force. And we have reasonably low costs because we have such scale, and because Chinese labor costs are at that time in particular were very competitive. By 1992, Jiang Zemin got behind this and said, not only should Chinese companies go out, but Chinese companies should go out into Africa as a priority. Make Africa your priority. This was decided almost from the very beginning of the going out period, and it involved another set of very special insights. One of them was, yes, the provincial leaders tell us the only business they think they have any competitive advantage in at that time is in infrastructure development. Well, this leads to the follow-on insight that Africa has this incredible thirst and need for infrastructure. So this is something you can compete for. And the Chinese state will find a way to get behind us by creating facilities of various sorts, state bank facilities, so that we will finance the contracts of big Chinese companies to underdeveloped African countries that don't easily qualify or readily qualify for other sorts of contracts in world markets, be they multilateral lending arrangements or bilateral or commercial lending arrangements, right? The Chinese state will get behind this through what are known as policy banks. They will guarantee the contracts of and provide financing for the construction of infrastructure by these state infrastructure development companies. I say state companies, but many of them back then were provincial companies. So these provinces are competing for this kind of business. The other insight that China understood, and this piece is also, I think, very poorly understood, even now in the present period of immense ongoing interest in China-Africa. China had this insight in the early 1990s about Africa, which has been vastly underappreciated in my view. And it grew out of a few things. One of them was a sophisticated understanding of Africa's demographics. So Africa in the early 1990s was 800 million people. It was understood, even in the early 1990s, that Africa by the middle of this century would be grosso modo 2 billion people. Why was it understood why would the Chinese have known this? Well, the main reason is that the UN does highly reputable and very competent ongoing studies of global demography. The UN gets a hard time from certain quarters, but this is something with a very good track record and very well established that has a very high buy-in rate from countries around the world, which provide their statistics in a sort of timely manner. And so the UN demography operation is highly reputed and has a record of performance in terms of the accuracy or margin of error of its demographic estimates. The UN, so the Chinese begin reading these reports, I think, in the late 1980s, and by the early 1990s have understood that something incredible is about to happen in Africa, that Africa is about to take off, and we are China. We are trying to become a manufacturing superpower. We know that. We want to sell things to other people. Well, you want to sell things to other people, it behooves you to know where are the new people going to come from. And the Chinese began to understand in the late 1980s and early 1990s that the marginal growth in the global population was going to be heavily concentrated in Africa. That China, I don't think, quite knew yet, or wasn't, I don't imagine, this is my imagination, was not entirely confident yet that it was going to conquer, as of the late 1980s or early 1990s, every market in the world. But they did have the insight, which in fact they have done, right? So Chinese products are now available across a broad gamut of goods all over the world, right? China has become an extraordinary manufacturing success. I don't think anybody knew fully in 1988 or 1992 the extent to which China was going to be able to realize this. However, in the early 1990s, by then, China is thinking Africa's population is going to double by the middle of this century. The marginal increase in global population is going to be heavily skewed toward Africa. Most of the additional urbanization in the world is going to be taking place in Africa. What happens when there's urbanization? When there's urbanization, economic activity intensifies. People begin to have all sorts of needs, which we'll just call, we'll put under the crude kind of portmanteau of modern. People begin to have modern needs, right? They want to have a roof over their head that's made of metal. They want to have a water heater. They want to have a refrigerator. They want to have tiles. They want to have, eventually a TV and a car, et cetera, and on, right? Well, that all begins with urbanization. So the Chinese knew in the late 1980s and early 1990s this extraordinary thing was going to happen in Africa called demographic takeoff and urbanization. And even if we're not sure we're going to conquer the consumer markets of the entire world by today, right? We do know that if we invest in developing business and connections and contact and commerce with Africa, we can build buy-in from African consumers and African political leaders and develop Africa, nurture Africa as a future market for us and for Chinese products. We don't have any famous products yet, but if we start now, our products in 15 or 20 years will be familiar products to China, to Africans. They will be just as familiar as Western products. And by the way, when I first started writing about China and Africa, which goes back already almost 20 years, Chinese products had a reputation for being very cheap and very unreliable and kind of low cachet and, very second best, right? And some people smirked about this. Some African consumers turned their noses up at Chinese products. But I was reminded of my own experience in a previous generation where I watched this very same thing happen with Japanese products. Japanese consumer products were they were transitioning from an era where they were very cheap and very unreliable, known to catch on fire or to blow up, to becoming very, very reliable and very, very desirable and very, very cost competitive, all at the same time. And so there's some very famous examples. I already mentioned Sony, but Toyota cars. Toyota cars, when I was a boy, were a joke. A joke. Toyota cars today are Toyota cars. So when I saw the Chinese consumer goods coming into Africa at the beginning of this century and seeing people talk about them in the way that they did, I said, well, yeah, I didn't think this is, China is doomed. I thought this is kind of the normal story, that you have to get your feet into the water and you learn from your mistakes and you keep continually trying to improve and you keep investing in these markets. And China did so for the reasons of understanding of demographics and of urbanization that I said, and placing a long-term bet on these sorts of relationships, right? But China did so for a further reason, which is also widely misunderstood or overlooked. So let's go back to the late 1980s or 1990s. What was happening in the rest of the world? So at the end of the 1980s, the Berlin Wall falls and the Soviet Union eventually dissolves. And this seems like a new epoch or era, right, in global affairs. And of course, nobody knew what was going to happen, but looking back, we can see very clearly what happened. Western Europe turned its attention to Eastern Europe, largely, initially, for reasons that make very compelling economic and historical sense, right? The Western Europeans said, we have this market on our, borders that consists, again, of highly educated people who are willing to work for relatively low wages, and we have the further incentive in the knowledge that when there's trouble in Eastern Europe, the trouble usually spreads to Western Europe too. And when there's trouble in Europe, usually it becomes eventually really bad trouble. Like we've had World War I, we've had World War II, et cetera, right? So let's, as Western Europeans, try to capture these markets in Eastern Europe, try to help Eastern Europe to get off the ground. Economically speaking, it'll be better in every sense for Europeans in general, right? Economically, politically, et cetera, right? So what happens in the United States? The United States, back then, there's this moment where various thinkers, I can't remember which French politician coined this phrase, but started talking about the United States as being a hyperpower, right? And the United States eventually settles in its own way through a variety of processes on sort of wars against terror. And these are largely wrapped up in the Muslim parts of the world, right? And China's watching all of this. And again, back to Jiang Zemin, let's go out, let's go to Africa, let's make Africa our priority. Part of the reason why let's make Africa our priority was not just the demographics and the urbanization, but the very fact that nobody else was looking at Africa. Western Europe was looking at Eastern Europe. The United States was sort of wandering around looking for dragons to slay. Africa is standing there, 800 million people. Nobody wanted to lend money to Africa. Nothing was happening developmentally in Africa. And the Chinese, the A level of Western corporate sort of energy was not invested in Africa. Westerners, of course, did business in Africa. The Japanese also did business in Africa, but it wasn't their A team that they sent here. It was not a priority for them, right? And Africa had come to be seen, especially in my country, but not only in my country, I believe, as kind of this problem child, this charity, this kind of burden that you have to lug around, that Africa's always trailing behind and it's always having a calamity of one kind or another. And the Chinese, by virtue of their own experience, never thought of Africa this way. I do not mean to say that Chinese people are idealistic. I do not believe Chinese people are idealistic. I do not mean to say that I buy into some of the rhetoric that is some of the most common rhetoric about China and Africa from China, which is like win-win, or we're all brothers in the South, or these sorts of, I don't buy into any of that stuff. However, the Chinese knew by virtue of their own experience that poverty and underdevelopment are not destined. They are not inescapable fates, right? That poverty is something that can be escaped. Chinese people knew that because Chinese people had been poor themselves in the very recent past. So they were primed to view Africa not as a perpetual charity case, as this condemned orphan of the world system that just is not worth bothering thinking about in economic terms, right? They were primed to think of Africa as a place where you could actually think about in terms of economics and in terms of money making, right? And so this was, I think, a heavily underrated feature in terms of this thing that happened in the early 1990s, where China said, let's go out to Africa, let's make Africa our priority. Africa's being disregarded or ignored by the rest of the rich world. By the way, this prevents, I think the Chinese believed at that time, an extra opportunity. The fact that Africa is being ignored by the major powers of the world means that China, with its fledgling companies and no brands and inexperience, can afford to go out into these markets and make mistakes and learn along the way and at relatively low cost or low risk to itself, right? And so this all gets underway in the early 1990s. By the mid-1990s, we see the first kind of seed beds of the migrant populations that I describe in my book. And now, of course, by now, there's Chinese people, as my friend in Mozambique told me, everywhere in Africa, and if you find a place that there's no Chinese people, don't go there, right? Because that means there's no business to be done. I want to sort of pitch the conversation forward a little bit to sort of hopefully set the stage for some of our questions. So for some people, China and Africa is old hat, right? China and Africa has been around for a long time. Early in this century, Africans were, in certain environments, surprised to encounter a Chinese person. Nobody is surprised to encounter a Chinese person almost anywhere in Africa anymore, right? But beyond that, there's this kind of new kid on the block in terms of Chinese global kind of thought. And the new kid is, of course, the Belton Road Initiative, BRI. And so Africa is old hat also in the sense that, China's major foreign policy and economic energy is being invested in this new thing, this new initiative, the Belton Road Initiative. And so I want to close in talking about how do these things relate. In a superficial way, they relate because BRI, the Belton Road Initiative, has become a kind of plaque that gets stamped on everything, right? Anything China does economically outside of China is eligible somehow, it would seem, to being called BRI, right? I have a Chinese colleague who I spoke with the other day who said to me, kind of funny, said to me, I'm not really sure what BRI is. I hadn't even asked her, right? She said, what is BRI? I'm like, wait a second. You're Chinese. Tell me, what is BRI? The reason for this confusion is that BRI, as I said, has just become a slogan. It's like throw BRI onto everything, slap the name BRI. It's all good, right? And so China, Africa, in a sense, has also been subsumed into BRI. So here we are in Kenya. Every project in Kenya is, of course, it's BRI. We're like on the Indian Ocean, and the Indian Ocean is part of the Silk Road. I mean, there's a whole deep mythology about the Silk Road and what all this means, but I don't want to spoil the party, right? It's all fun, it's all great, right? There's this history, yes, let's call it the Silk Road. Kenya has a claim to it, yes, there was this connection, during the Ming Dynasty to Kenya, et cetera, Zhenghe. And actually, there's a very profound connection between China, Africa, and BRI that is generally not perceived and is therefore widely overlooked. And the profound connection is that what happened between China and Africa beginning in the 1990s was really a kind of learning experience that prepped China for the Belton Road. Why would I say that? So we have already seen that China discovered through these conversations that the center, meaning the Communist Party and the central government, forced the provincial governments to kind of engage in, which is like, so we need you to go out, we want you to go out to Africa, make that your priority. And the provincial governments, as I told you, sort of had this moment of puzzlement, like what would we do? We've never been to Africa. We don't have anything to sell. This comes to the conclusion, actually we do have a competitive advantage in infrastructure development. This insight was kind of the training wheels for BRI. What is BRI other than a massive infrastructure development program, right? I do not believe that China started in the 1990s thinking, okay, we'll do this in Africa, and that will become the prelude to doing this throughout Central Asia and on to Europe. However, I do believe that the experience that China gleaned in Africa from the 1990s onward has been fundamental in understanding its strategies and approaches toward a more general push toward global expansion, toward global engagement, toward global business through infrastructure development. And the advantages that China got in Africa received a kind of proof of concept, which encouraged the Chinese state to pursue them on this much bigger stage, this world stage that has come to be called BRI. So what are these advantages? The advantages are that, again, mostly state companies, meaning state infrastructure development companies, will go out into the world and seek contracts, and that Chinese state banks, the jargon for these is policy banks, these Chinese state banks, China Development Bank, et cetera, will guarantee financing at a mixture of commercial and subsidized rates, and that Chinese workers will carry out a very large portion of the actual physical labor in these projects, and that Chinese providers of the sort of principal materials that go into infrastructure development will provide those materials. So if you think about these various components, the synergies are incredible. So China lends, and this is just how it is, right? This isn't negative, this isn't positive. I think that kind of polarity is usually not helpful in this kind of discussion. China goes out and it says, we'll lend money. First of all, so our companies, the builders, will go out and they will drum up business, and the state banks will provide the financing. So a Kazakhstan or a Tajikistan or an Uganda or what have you, a Greece, or most recently Italy, or could be Jamaica. Maybe they have trouble raising the kinds of capital they would need for their infrastructure development on a large scale. We'll provide the guaranteed financing at a mixture of commercial and subsidized rates, right? Our companies will provide the materials. We will provide the engineering expertise and the other high-end stuff, and we will provide, in most cases, a very goodly portion of the mid-level and even low-level labor that goes into these projects. So the beauty of this from the Chinese point of view is that all of this flows back to China. So China lends, let's imagine, $1 billion to country X to build a bridge or a road or an airport or what have you, right? That money has to be, that's financing. That money has to be paid back, and a portion of that is at a commercial rate, which means China makes a profit from the lending from that, simply at a financial level. However, what's better is that the financing is financing to a Chinese company to build the thing, right? It's not to a Greek company or to a Ugandan company or to a Costa Rican company, generally speaking. It's to a Chinese contractor to build the thing. And when the Chinese contractor sets out to build the thing, what does it need to do so? It needs steel, it needs cement, it needs aluminum, it needs optic fiber, it needs whatever the other various kinds of components that go into these sorts of big projects is, and it sources those things where? In China. And the people who do the physical labor and the people who do the higher end labor are also, to a large extent, sourced in China. And so the $1 billion gets loaned out to country X, Y, or Z, and all of that or nearly all of that, flows back to China, meaning China is being paid in multiple ways, right? It's being paid at the level of simple finance. You have to service that finance, which means there's a profit at the financial level. But that finance is also being used to pay Chinese companies who hire Chinese workers and use Chinese materials, meaning all of that revenue is flowing back to China in a way of kind of creates these incredible synergies and virtuous cycles of finance, right? So China discovered all of that in Africa, in China, Africa, right? And I say this isn't good or this isn't bad, and I'm going to close on how you should think of good or bad, right? It's just the way it is. It's a model that China discovered, and who's to blame China for setting itself up this way, right? It didn't find any competitors in the global kind of high ambition infrastructure development market. It said we have a great stock of standing expertise and capacity in these sorts of industries, and we have $3 or $4 trillion of national savings that we need to find a better way to deploy than simply putting them all in American Treasury bills. So this is something that makes sense for us, right? And China proved these concepts in Africa, and then in the last, since 2013, has morphed them into something called Belton Road, which it has spread all around the world to this point, where Belton Road, as my Chinese friend asked me, so what is Belton Road? Belton Road, almost the only place you can't find Belton Road is in the United States. I mean, Belton Road, that's not literally true. So there's no Belton Road in Japan, there's no Belton Road, I think, in India, there's no Belton Road in a few places, but pretty much Belton Road is everywhere, right? China learned all of those strategies in Africa. China perfected all of those approaches in Africa. China didn't set out, as I said, I've seen no evidence to think that China set out in 1992 and said, phase one is Africa, phase two will do the same thing in, something we'll call Belton Road. However, China mastered the know-how and the financial expertise and the kind of integration. And China learned lots of other lessons in Africa. So Africa is 54 countries, meaning Africa is highly balkanized. Africa has high political risk in many of its countries. Africa is poorly integrated in many ways. Well, so I don't know if many of you have been to Central Asia, but that's a pretty good description of Central Asia. Central Asia is balkanized. Central Asia has lots of political risk. Central Asia has economic underdevelopment. It has misgovernance, et cetera, et cetera. So China learned at a political level how to deal in these environments in Africa, and it's applying those lessons on a much bigger scale today around the world. And so Africa has been, in that sense, a great school for China. Africans tend to think of other people coming, giving lessons, and sort of spreading things or sharing things. Africa has been the springboard for other parts of the world. Just before this talk, I gave a brief kind of introduction to my current book project, which is actually about how Africa developed Europe. Africa has this long history of being a springboard for other parts of the world. It's an unfortunate history in some ways for Africa because it often hasn't worked out to Africa's advantage. It's also unfortunate because Africa often is not recognized in this way, even after having served for the benefit of other parts of the world so generously, right? It's almost never gets mentioned. So what is in it for Africa? A lot of the China-Africa conversation gets wrapped up into pro-China or anti-China discussion. And I'm American, and so for some people that would inevitably mean, oh, he's American, therefore that means he's coming from a point of view that is critical of China, or on the other side of the coin, if a Chinese person is talking to you, you may expect much the same from them from the other direction. I can't blame you if you wish to cling to that point of view. However, I'd like to urge you to think about things in another way. So it's high time, in my view, that Africa find a way to escape being caught up in these kinds of polarities, right? And to begin to think in a more rational and systematic way about Africa's own self-interest. Is China good for Africa? My answer to you is that depends. China, the fact that China has big ambitions in this part of the world is, everything else being equal, a good thing. Having people that want to do business with you, having people who want to invest, having more partners, potential partners, is a net good, right? I don't think there's any way of escaping that. Any American or any European or anyone who tells you that China-Africa is simply a bad thing is there's something not right, right? Having partners who want to do ambitious things with you is good. However, it's not enough, right? A successful partnership means that you have to remain in control of your end of the equation, of what you're going to get out of this, and what you're going to have to pay for this, right? And I think that this isn't unique to China-Africa. I think that there's this, if one thinks historically speaking, there's this irrational exuberance that one can see in African history, where new partners come along and Africans begin to invest kind of an excess optimism about the things that they're going to get from these partnerships, forgetting sometimes that the people who are engaging with you are, rightly speaking, engaging with you for their own interest. That doesn't mean they're bad guys. That doesn't mean there's something wrong with them. That means they're acting out of the most normal impulses of human nature. People travel far away to engage with another place. It means they've come for something, right? They didn't just leave their home wandering around. They showed up looking for something, right? It doesn't mean, they may be very friendly, but it doesn't mean they came because they're friendly. They came because they had something they were looking for. This shouldn't be stigmatized. This isn't a criticism of China. The Europeans came here too. They were looking for something. Much of that history is very ugly, right? But Africans have to be, I think, more realistic and more skeptical and more rigorous about figuring out the best ways to operationalize these engagements for their own true long-term national interests. You know, there's this very unfortunate, one of the many unfortunate legacies of the imperial period in Africa is that Africa is very famously this highly balkanized environment. I've already said 54 countries. Most of the countries are small. Many of the countries are landlocked. Many of the countries have no natural resources that are highly prized on world markets. Some of them do, and have high concentrations of these things. In other words, this is a very uneven and unwieldy kind of space in terms of political economy, right? This is a legacy that's going to be very hard to overcome under the best of circumstances, but Africa's got to figure out a way to overcome it, right? And going one by one to negotiate a railroad or, you know, an industrialization plan or things of that scale and nature, right, is probably not going to be the way to get your best deal, right? Africans have been slow, in my view, somebody who's been watching this for 20 years, in understanding this, right? So the Chinese begin to explore the business in the way I described in the early 1990s, and it really ramps up, and around 2000, 2001, 2003, sort of achieves a kind of high, cruising altitude and has this immense momentum of its own, right? And this coincides with the time when I begin to look closely at what we call China-Africa, right? The feeling that I most remember from this period is one of this most extraordinary exuberance, right? The African countries, I'm not talking about the populations for the most part. It's hard to know what populations think in general, but it was very easy to know what the people in government felt, what the elites felt. The Chinese are coming, they want to do this, they want to do that, they have money, they're guaranteed, you know, they said, no problem, like you can't bring we'll bring the financing, right? There was this extraordinary exuberance. And I don't blame, I mean, it's understandable at the human level, but it was not ideal in terms of protecting one's own self-interest. To be really crude and quick about this, the idea was, so they came and they were so eager to do business. I just said, you know, where do we sign? And nobody paid much attention to the details. not even at the national level, never mind thinking that maybe the best way to do this isn't at the national level. Maybe the best way, if I'm a Ghana, a Togo, and a Burkina Faso, is to build an integrated plan. Or if I'm a Kenya, a Tanzania, and a Uganda, to build an integrated plan. Or if I'm a Sudan, or a South Sudan, and an Ethiopia, to build an integrated plan. Or if I'm a Zambia, and a Zimbabwe, and a Botswana, to build an integrated plan. Now you may object that the Chinese didn't, that's not what they came to offer, and they were really in a hurry to do business, and they're being very generous, and they wanted us to sign something, but that's to lose sight of your own control and agency in these matters, right? And it's not the duty of the Chinese to tell you what's best for you. And in fact, the Chinese have been very good about that. They say, it's not our business to tell you. We just want to know, what do you want to do? Tell us what you want to do. But the Africans so far have not been very good, in my view, even as of this late date, in asserting a clear vision of what's best for them in these bargains. They're lucky to have partners that are growing in number. It's not just the Chinese. The Turks, the Russians, India is of course very important. There are many, there's a proliferation of partners, right? But the Africans have to elevate their game in order to be able to extract something that shows a vision and that shows an understanding of leverage and that shows a kind of a willingness to kind of think beyond, outside of the box in the cliche, beyond the sort of balkanized realities that are kind of permanent limitation for African development. Otherwise, there will be no end to African underdevelopment.
Can I throw a question to you before I throw it to the audience? One of the elements in all of this was the need to secure natural resources as well, right? I mean, if you look at the development of China, it was a locomotive that needed feeding. And in that context, Howard, I think if I look back, they were innovative in the sense that for most African countries, let's take something like Zambia, in the old days you produced copper, no one was willing to finance your copper production for 5 or 10 years. And you had the Chinese coming in and saying, you know what, we actually need copper for the next 10 years. We'll give you a 10-year a guarantee of offtake, and with those funds that we've now promised you, we can finance the railway, we can finance. So in a way, they took more risk, or perceived risk, in hard to visit or riskier countries. But if you look at it now, let's look at somewhere like Venezuela, where they're on the hook big time, or somewhere like Angola, which doesn't have any spare oil, because all its oil is now having to pay debts to China. Was that an important factor?
There are two things going on with your question. One of them is that it's true. China had a vocation for itself beginning in the special economic zone period. Already a vision then. We want to emerge as a manufacturing power. We think that that is our best to ending poverty and emerging as restoring our place, the place that we believe as Chinese people we should be in the world, right? That path passes through manufacturing. And if you want to manufacture, you need to know two things. Well, you need to know a bunch of things. But on one end, as I said, you need to know where the markets are going to be. And so that led to Africa, right, as we described. At the other end, you need to know where the input's going to come from, which means where the natural resource is going to come from. And Africa is an immensely important storehouse of most of the main natural resources that go into these sorts of materials, right? Bauxite, iron, cobalt, manganese, on and on and on, right? However, I don't think that there was any great risk in terms of the Zambia example you cited. Zambia only has copper, right? at the end of the day, Zambia's got to sell its copper to somebody. If you're Zambian, it's great that there's Chinese demand, but it's not like you're going to withhold the copper, right? Whoever wants to buy it, you need to find a buyer. And it happened to be, in this particular period of Zambia's history, that the buyer of standing was China. Oil is different. Lots and lots of countries pump out oil. I think China made a mistake with oil. You cited the example of Venezuela. You cited the example of Angola. China, like every country, has strategic misconceptions that are based on kind of misunderstandings or almost mythologies. And one of China's mythologies is that, okay, we have to import a lot of oil, and if there's a war with the United States or global conflict of some kind, our oil supplies will be cut off, and therefore we need to find ways to lock down lots of oil and to guarantee a supply of oil. I think that's a mistake. Mistake in the sense that you end up spending more for oil than you needed to spend for it. Oil is fungible, meaning that if Venezuela sells you the oil, then Mexico doesn't need to sell you the oil. If Mexico sells you the oil, then Angola doesn't need to. Oil can come from dozens and dozens of places, right? You don't need to lock it down. And so China went to Venezuela out of this idea, in part. Yes, we have this insecurity about our energy supplies. Let's go spend a lot of money and, all of these unrealistic lending programs in Venezuela. And at the end of the day, if everything goes wrong, we can still get the oil out of them. I think that was a mistake. China's not going to have any problem buying oil. The oil market, global oil market, this is not meant to be cute or a pun, is highly fluid. You have the money to buy oil, there will be people to sell you the oil. Any time of day, right? 24 hours, right? And so China paid more than it needed to out of this notion of insecurity over oil in places like Venezuela, in places like Angola. And that was a consequence of, these were, in my view, mistakes that China made several years ago, going back 20 years now, because it was relatively inexperienced in kind of these sorts of global geostrategic economic initiatives or strategies. China, I think, is much. If China could redo it today, they'd do it differently.
You've spoken about the personality of Mao. You've spoken about Deng. You've spoken about Zemin. Tell us a little bit about the Xi Jinping, president for life. That seemed to be putting himself at a different level to all the previous leaders. Now in this very adversarial situation with Trump, tell us what you read from the personality. Is he the paramount leader in a way that goes back to the imperial system? I heard you in an interview describe him, I can't remember the exact words, as he's not ingratiating himself, he's imposing himself. This is what you said.
I don't know if he'll be president for life. There are many things we don't know, right? He has set himself up to, in theory, rule indefinitely. But that's only in theory. Lots of things can happen that don't accord with the president for life outcome. Well, one of them is actually president for life, but you don't live long, right? Yes. So you can die by accident, right? That's known to happen to people, right? So you can die next year or today or in 10 years, right? That's not what we think of as president for life, right? Or you could be ousted. These are not predictions, but we don't know what the future holds for this person or for any person, right? We do know that, as I said, Mao went through a series of succession scenarios, naming a successor, beginning with the first person, a guy named Liu Shaoqi in the early 1960s, who was Deng Xiaoping's patron, and who Mao purged he let Deng sort of escape from view and kind of do his penance somewhere, out of view, right? But he put Liu Shaoqi under house arrest. And Liu Shaoqi was a diabetic, and it is said that he was beaten. He was certainly denied medical care, and he died. This guy was the president of China, and he died basically under house arrest, right? Because Mao thought, well, he's a secret capitalist. He's going to try to introduce capitalist mechanisms in the Chinese economy. He keeps trying to undo my socialism, right? And so that was the first of, I think, 4 people that Mao sets up as his putative successors. And in each case, the successor doesn't get to succeed him, right? Deng Xiaoping comes along, and he says, this is really dangerous, that having so much uncertainty about who is the leader creates instability and creates intrigue and creates all sorts of destabilizing our political system. And so I'm going to, meaning Deng is going to, create a regular system of succession. And so Deng institutionalizes a system of succession where China has this bicephal system of a state ruler and a premier. And one of them is kind of the head of government, and the other one usually is the head of the Communist Party plus the head of state, right? And that in the middle, so they share power in certain ways. The premier usually handles the economic dossier, and the head of state, and who is also the head of the Communist Party, which is the most important function, handles all the other stuff, pretty much, and is the number one, right? And under Deng's system, these 2 characters serve 5-year terms, and they are limited to 2 5-year terms. They can be ousted in theory at the end of a single 5-year term, but under all circumstances, by the end of the first 5-year term, a designated successor appears already on the horizon. And the choice of this successor is made in a collegial way at the level of the highest instances of the party. So the advantages of this was it eliminated all of the intrigue, that the incoming leaders were all vetted and had been approved in a collegial way by the highest instances of the party and had buy-in. And they had a period, just as Xi Jinping himself had, when they were in French you say the dauphin, meaning the designated successor. They sort of put you on training wheels, and you begin gradually to be put into various kinds of leadership functions before taking power, right? This is a beautiful system. It was an extraordinary achievement. Some people say, political scientists, Western political scientists say, this is unique in the history of authoritarianism, that there has been no major authoritarian political system in the world that had regularized succession. Think about it. Can you find an example? In authoritarian systems, the leaders always get killed or removed by a coup. Under Mao, they were always killed or removed by a coup. That's how else, if you're an authoritarian, that means nobody can remove you. I mean, that's an essential quality of being an authoritarian leader, right? That there are no institutions that can counterbalance you, and that there are no regular mechanisms for replacing you. Therefore, the only way to replace you is through intrigue, right? And that this becomes very costly in terms of the life of a country. So Xi comes to power under quite extraordinary circumstances. So it had been known several years under this regular sort of scenario that he was going to be the next guy. And his number 2 was also known several years in advance. And just before it was time for Xi to take power, Xi disappeared from public view.
Yes, what was that about?
We don't know. So I don't remember exactly how long it was, a week, something like that, maybe a couple of weeks. I don't remember. The detail's not important to this conversation, but he completely disappears from view. And there are all kinds of discussions, even till now, about what did this mean? And I have no idea what happened, and anybody who tells you they know for sure is lying to you, because no one outside of a very small circle of people knows for sure. But one of the most prominent theories about what happened is that he was basically negotiating with the highest instances of the party for these extraordinary powers that he has come to occupy, right? He basically, this is a theory, it's not my theory, it is a widespread theory. He basically told them, look, okay, so we're to the eve of the announcement of the succession right now. I'm not going to do it unless you agree to do all of these things. And if you follow this storyline, this would have sent the high level of the party into kind of panic, because what an extraordinary thing it would have been for him to walk away. I don't think he would have walked away, but it was kind of a game of chicken, right? If this happened, right? And so they said to him, okay, well, what powers do you need? And he said basically all the powers, right? That the premier won't be governing the economy, and I'll be in charge of everything, and eventually I'll change the succession arrangements. So I have no idea if that's what happened. That's a very widely held view of what happened, right? I want to be very clear that I don't know any of this, right? What we do know is that he did eventually change the succession arrangements, right? And so here we are in this situation where she is no longer limited to 2 5-year terms. She became, in the interim, during these first 5 years, I mentioned these leading small groups, right? So I don't remember, there's a saying in Chinese about how he is the leader of all of the leading small groups. Basically, that's not normally the way it had been. Like, you sort of spread the authority around the highest levels of the party and let this guy over here be the head of that leading small thing, and this guy over there, and this other person. And by the way, they're all guys, in charge of this, in charge of that. She has basically been in charge of all of the groups that count for major stuff, right? The premier, Li Keqiang, does not appear to be very influential in terms of even the economy, which is the traditional domain of a premier. And so what I make of this is that it has undone the stability, which was a real achievement under Deng, of the political system. On the idea, which I think Xi himself sold, that this is an extraordinary time. It's a time of extraordinary challenges for China, and that we need decisive leadership. We have to deal with internal corruption, which he made as one of his great kind of initiatives from the very beginning, and we have all of these international challenges. And that over the coming years, and it was not defined what that meant, but more or less indefinitely, that China faces a very challenging political kind of environment, globally speaking, right? So this was the justification, but here's what I make of the justification. This follows, in my thinking, a kind of paradigm, which I'll call, and I do not believe Xi is an emperor, right? You mentioned that. Having said that, I'm going to use imperial language. So there's this idea, there's this theory that's called the good emperor theory. It's great to live in an empire when you have a good emperor, right? If the emperor is good, things are good. But what happens when you don't have a good emperor? And so let's imagine that everything works out well, reasonably speaking, under Xi. Right? So he took these extraordinary powers for himself at the cost of undoing the regular mechanisms of succession in China. So Xi stays on, I think, how old is Xi now, 67 or something? I don't remember exactly. But let's give him 15 more years in power, right? And then he goes. And maybe it's the next emperor, or maybe it's the emperor after that, but you don't any longer have these mechanisms. And so eventually you're going to have one who's not a good emperor. What happens then? You understand the problem, right? So is the putative benefit of tailoring the rules to fit a good emperor, and I do not believe Xi is an emperor, but we're using that language, right? Is the putative benefit for tailoring the rules for a good emperor enough to outweigh the eventual risks of having those kinds of rules for a bad emperor? Bad emperor comes along, he says, hey, these are the rules. I didn't make up the rules. I'm going to rule forever too, and I'm going to be in charge of everything. And anybody who doesn't like it, I'm going to say that they're corrupt and put them in jail. And that's the end of the discussion, right? I'm not Chinese. This is not for me to worry about, right? But this is...
But that phenomenon you're describing applies also to the African.
Of course, it applies to any authoritarian setting, right?
You mentioned that in the 1980s, China's comparative advantage was infrastructure, but now we're seeing technology as one of its biggest comparative advantage with 5G, with AI. I know it wants to be a global leader by 2025. Especially in the continent where we're seeing like the Kenyan government, for example, is collecting data of its population through Huduma number, and in Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwean government is working with a Chinese startup to collect facial recognition systems of its citizens. So what is your thought process or your understanding of the new Belton Road strategy, especially when it comes to the data collection, data, emerging technologies, and again, what do you think, especially with the whole idea of like data colonialism? It's a very interesting conversation that's happening with Yuval, for example. But what is your feedback?
But I think that China has been careful not to publicly associate BRI with the sale or encouragement of what I'll call policing technologies. This may be part of course, the internal discussions between China and the various countries that it's doing business with, but China doesn't want its BRI brand to become a brand of surveillance, because that wouldn't do well for its image. That China wants to do business in that space, but it doesn't want that to become the image of BRI. So how does an African country deal with all of this? And this sort of segues a little bit into the area of the second question, or the second lady's question, right? There are all of these discussions among people who follow China-Africa topics about what is China's relationship with these technologies and their commercialization really mean? Does China have a strategy where it wishes deliberately to promote a surveillance state, or is this rather something more incidental, where China has companies that are highly capable in these technologies and simply sells them to whoever wants to buy them, but is not actively promoting them? I don't have an empirical answer for you to that question. However, my gut tells me that China, everything else being equal, feels more comfortable in a world where political rules and mores are more or less similar to its own way of doing business. That doesn't strike me as unusual. I love democracy. I think democracy is a good thing, right? I'm not here to proselytize about democracy to people. However, it's normal to think, I think, that if you are a big non-democratic power, you would feel more comfortable if in the world there were other countries that embraced those sorts of values too, right? Who wants to be the only non-democratic country, right? And so there is an argument that says, and I don't have the empirical answer, but there is an argument that says China is quite eager to see authoritarian techniques spread around the world because this helps normalize China's own behavior. That argument makes sense to me. I don't see evidence that China has a high-level strategic campaign to do these sorts of things, but that makes a certain intuitive sense to me. So where does this leave African countries? When China began to do business in Africa beginning in the 1990s, as we discussed, I think one of the biggest learning lessons for China then, and this continues to be a challenge for China now, although China has learned a lot, was in discovering that African countries, although generally very small and very poor, had very vibrant civil societies. I don't think China was prepared for what that meant in the 1990s. So Chinese companies show up in the 1990s, they're prospecting for business, they're signing contracts, they're talking win-win, their governments are signing so quickly they don't even read the fine print, they're not bothered to negotiate very hard or to ask their neighbors who have already done deals with China, what should they be looking out for, right? They're just signing on, right? China was surprised to see that in one country after another, the civil society of that country wasn't happy. The government's proclaiming, we got a new hospital, we got a new port, we got a new airport, we got a new railway. Great news, we're going to run for re-election on this basis. And the civil societies, going back to the 1990s and continuing in some cases, in many cases, till today, didn't receive the news with unbridled enthusiasm. It was like, well, what does this really mean? I mean, what is the real cost? And how much corruption is involved? And why, what sort of technology transfer is there? And why are there Chinese workers pushing brooms, on construction sites? And things like that. China didn't anticipate that. And still, because China doesn't allow for much space in its own political mechanisms for civil society, is still not comfortable with that. China doesn't have those reflexes to dealing with a vibrant civil society. So what does this mean for the data question, the facial recognition and surveillance state kinds of questions? What it means, I think, is that the onus is on African civil societies to push their governments for the right kinds of outcomes. That if you expect your government to look out for your interests in this regard, put China out of the picture. You're going to be disappointed. It's not going to work out for you because governments like to do big business contracts. Governments generally like surveillance. Governments generally like to be able to access people's private data with little check on their power, right? So it's incumbent on African civil societies to be, in my opinion, to be up to the task of holding their government's feet to the fire in ways that assure privacy rights, that assure transparency about surveillance technologies, that ensure the proper sort of procedures in terms of justice and law with regard to data and with regard to all of these privacy issues, that the state is not, China is certainly not going to look out for your rights in those regards, and neither will most African states, absent pressure. And the place the pressure is going to come from, if it comes, is from civil society. This is hard work. And this is going to require action at the local level, and mobilization, and organization, and lobbying, and politicking, right? And it's not going to be easy. But if this is an important issue to you, as I sense it is, these are battles that are going to have to be fought and that you're going to have to commit yourself to winning. That nobody's going to do this for you. If it's not China, it will be someone else, right?
Africa's debt. There have been warnings by development economists and some of the Bretton Woods institutions that China is burdening Africa or African countries with enormous debt that some of these countries might not be able to repay, and that it's in fact using debt to expand its global influence.
So let me say, I do not buy the theory that China is deliberately trying to entrap countries with debt so that it can seize their assets. That makes no sense to me. It makes no sense to me because I think China is primarily interested in doing business to make money, and that's not a very good business model. You seize somebody's port somewhere, you can't pack it up and go home with it. You still have a port in their country. Why did you go through all the trouble of building the port only to seize it? That's not a good operational model for sort of money making and a kind of the capitalist mode of profit making that China is pursuing here. That's point one. Point two, I think that as has already begun to happen with an accumulation of cases like this, it begins to have a very nasty rebound on China's image. And China is jealous of its image. China doesn't want to have a bad image. One of the things China is doing is seeking power. Power comes in many forms. I believe China is a very ambitious country and wishes to be as powerful as possible. And one of the components of power is soft power. And I think China has an overweening desire for soft power. That China has, this is a puzzle that China hasn't figured out, that China is investing hugely in. And China is like, why is the West so powerful in soft power terms? The West had imperialism, the West had colonialism, the West engaged in slavery, the West did this. We're China, we didn't do any of those things, and we don't have any soft power, and we're spending all this money on. So I don't think China wants to go around seizing assets in countries and trapping places in debt deliberately and then seizing their assets. Also, because I think they understand that this have a very negative impact on their soft power, right? So what is China doing? China has this very famous concept in which its entire population is educated and socialized, of having endured a century of humiliation. The century of humiliation was from the Opium Wars in the 19th century until the communist victory, which the Chinese state calls the liberation in 1949, right? According to this narrative, and many of the sort of bones of this narrative are correct, China, throughout most of its history, was the biggest, or if not the biggest at all times, one of the very biggest economies in the world, right? Something happened during the century of humiliation. China gets relegated to the kind of second or third rank of global power, and the global economy comes to be dominated by these North Atlantic countries, and later by Japan. China is trying to reconfigure the global economy. We are 17% of the world's population. We were, for most of human history, the most sophisticated and richest part of the world. We want the world to be like that again. I don't think that's irrational. So China has been trying to find ways to bid its way into the global economy and to gain power, economically speaking. And part of that story I told you in my talk. And another part of the story is not by seeking to entrap countries in debt, but by using its enormous national savings to find business for itself and to expand its economic relations with other parts of the world and with non-traditional partners in the world. China acquired a bunch of new partners, if you want to call them partners, the Western countries, right? The non-traditional partners are all of these other parts of the world in what is sometimes called the global south or what have you, right? China wants to do business with them, and it's not a friendly world. You know, it's in a hurry. And so it's found that one way that it can find access to new markets is by wielding this enormous national savings it has. And we talked about some of these mechanisms, these virtuous cycles that it can engineer to achieve construction projects and infrastructure initiatives in other parts of the world, ensure good capital flows for it back to China, right? That's what China is doing. China is using this lending power. The problem with the debt in specific is that a couple of famous Western designed, but actually multilateral institutions, and by the way, China belongs to these institutions, called, well, actually there are three. Two of them China belongs to, one of them it does not belong to. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, China belongs to. China is the biggest borrower from the World Bank. Most people don't know that. China lends lots of money around the world. Even now, it's borrowing concessional lending from the World Bank. It is the biggest borrower from the World Bank. Anyway, the International Monetary Fund, which China also belongs to, kind of sets the tone in terms of international lending. It inspects the books of countries. It decides what the capacity for payback of countries, of their financial health, to be simple, right? And both governments and commercial banks take their lead from what the International Monetary Fund says about the health and the financial management of individual countries, individual borrowing countries. Well, so China has come along with these huge national savings and this will to do business in infrastructure and the like, and says we're not going to be bound by those kinds of guidance, that kind of guidance. If we want to lend, we'll lend. We don't have to not lend just because the IMF says that Zimbabwe is not creditworthy, or that Kenya has enough debt, or that, you know, it's too risky in country X, Y, or Z, right? We want to lend, we'll lend. We'll figure out a way to get paid back. Maybe that means being paid back in kind. They'll give us, in the case of Venezuela, their oil, or in the case of Ghana, their cocoa, or in the case of, you know, whatever, right? China's trying to elbow its way into other spaces and has the advantage of lots of national accumulated savings and a political system that allows it to tell these development banks what sorts of initiatives to pursue. The problem arises in the third institution. So China belongs to the IMF and to the World Bank. It does not belong to a more informal group called the Club of Paris. And the Club of Paris is a group of basically Western countries that get together and compare notes about the financial creditworthiness of countries around the world. And they agree that if we among ourselves decide a country is not creditworthy, none of us will lend to that country. But China doesn't want to belong to that group because China is willing to take more risk to lend to these countries in order to gain more business for itself. China is trying to gain space for itself in the international economy in these non-traditional places which have been dominated for a long time by Western countries. And so China's taking more risk. One of its selling points was, we don't tell African countries what to do. We don't get involved in your internal political situation. We're not going to interfere in any way. We made a great point of, we're not like the Western countries. They're busybodies. They want to tell you what to think. They want to tell you what to do. They want to tell you what's right. They want to tell you what's wrong. This was a tremendous selling point. So African civil societies then were skeptical about many things, even in the early 1990s, with regard to China, Chinese contracts, Chinese labor arrangements, Chinese sort of technical transfer of know-how and things like that. But they were not skeptical about this. This was a really easy thing to sell. Africans, yeah, we know what it's like to deal with bossy Westerners. The Westerners come here, they think they know everything. They want to tell us, we've seen that. We don't like that. The Westerners can go to hell. Look, the Chinese, they don't want to tell us what to do. We like that, right? Well, I sometimes have asked my students, I want you to try an experiment. Go out on Broadway and just stop people randomly and tell them you want to lend them $10,000 and you don't want to ask any questions. Tell them, I don't have any conditions. I just want to lend you money. And see what they think. Are they going to think it's a good idea? They're going to think there's something going on here. Like, what should I be? Well, look, clearly there's a hook. I got to, even if they need money, they're going to be thinking, is my car going to disappear overnight? Are they going to, what's going to happen, right? It's because in real life, this doesn't usually happen. People don't usually come up to you and offer you under the basis of no scrutinizing your capacities and no conditions to lend you, to just give you stuff, right? China did that because it wanted to squeeze its way into this business called the non-traditional partners, right? It had to find a way, and it had this competitive advantage, not of the infrastructure piece that I spoke of, but this huge accumulation of capital that it could deploy, and could deploy it with political direction, right? And so I don't think that this was done with some predetermined notion of we're going to entrap people with debt, but I do think this is a logical outcome of no conditions. It's not for me to tell Chinese people how to run China. It's not for me to tell African people how to run their African countries. But I do not think borrowing under no conditions is a good idea. You may be sick of Westerners telling you what to think, but if somebody wants to do business with me and they're not at all concerned about how I run my country, that's going to cause, in my mind, profound questions. Like, what's really going on here? Like, okay, they call this a win-win partnership, but look, I wouldn't choose a partner. Let's talk about human beings, individuals, right? I wouldn't choose a partner who was not interested in what I'm actually really doing. Like, how am I running my life? Like, you want to be my partner and you don't want to interfere in that? Well, we can't really be partners then, can we?
I'd like to find out what you think about, we've seen the CCP, and especially now with President Xi Jinping in power, cracking down on feminist movements, especially the famous five, and critics who are in China's leading universities like Tsinghua and Beida being arrested or being being fired because of criticizing Xi Jinping. And another social issue that we have is China's aging population, and also the problem of there being lots of unmarried men. And we've seen this create a rise in the bride kidnapping from China's neighbors. So do you think these three issues will be a source of political and social instability in China? And how do you think this will be seen in Africa?
I think that China has done fantastically in the last generation. It has exceeded its own expectations, in my view. But I think the Chinese leadership is highly insecure. They are worried. And they are worried about a lot of things. Population is demographics. China has just emerged from its period, which is often called the demographic dividend, in which the ratio of working age people to the ratio compared to dependents, meaning children and elderly people, has been very high. And in a historically brief period of time, it is tilting into the exact opposite, a period when the ratio is going to be incredibly ugly, when the number of dependents, in this case mostly elderly people and very few young people, is going to be high, and the number of working people is going to be low. The Chinese workforce is declining, look this up for yourself if you don't believe me, by 5 million people a year right now. 5 million less people working in China every year, less working because they're too old, they're retiring, right? This has profound implications for everything that one can imagine, right? And so I've written an article about this a couple of years ago in a magazine called Atlantic, which you can find with just search my name, and you'll find it about Chinese demographics and the financial and strategic implications of this. But Xi Jinping is in a hurry in large part, I believe, because he knows that sometime in the next decade, an enormous crunch is going to come based on these demographics, where China's liabilities in terms of pensions and retirement and long-term health care for the elderly and for chronic disease and things like that are going to go through the roof on a scale like you cannot imagine. China will have more people over the age of 65 than Britain, France, Japan, Italy, Canada, and a couple of other countries have total population combined. More people over the age of 65 than all of those countries combined. And you have to take care of those people. The children of those people have grown up with very high expectations and have grown up in large numbers according to a very prosperous kind of middle-class existence. When their parents enter that age, they're going to want their parents to be taken care of decently, and that means expensively. And China is going to have to face that. So China is exiting the period when it had the wind at its back, and it's entering a period where it's going to have a hurricane coming in the other direction, right? And your question was, that final question was about a small piece of this, which is also very interesting and very important, which has to do with the fact that China has, and I don't remember the exact number here, but this is off the top of my head. You can Google it. It's easy to find out. I may be off. But China has something like 90 million more men of reproductive age than women. Can you believe that? Let's imagine I'm off by half. Okay, China has 45 million more men of reproductive age than women of reproductive age. Okay, what's going to happen with that? Where do you send 45 million men? Where do you get women for 45, excuse me, it sounds so crude, right? But where do you find women for 45 million men, right? I mean, I'm not really sure. What's the combination of countries that can help out in that regard? You know, and what do they do? Right, they have men too. Right? Excuse me to reducing women to a factor in an equation, but this is what demography does, right? This is not about, I'm not trying to explore the gender politics piece of this, right? But just as a demographic issue, this is unbelievable, right? And nobody's ever seen anything like this in history before. And anyone who tells you they know how this is going to end up is lying, because it's unprecedented.
My question relates to how a country that's so recently become, or I guess re-become, a superpower sees itself. For many of the audience here who have been on the SGR will have known that at the terminus there is a bust cast in bronze of Zheng He, who is the explorer that you mentioned and who you write about in your latest book with a badly translated script about him being an early diplomat 600 years ago and something something friendship, something something Mombasa, something something. It is a recent, his ghost has been recently evoked or brought again for political purposes, which you argue in your book and you can speak to in a bit. My question is whether or not this is something that is particular to China in the way that China has always loved to speak of geopolitics with a sort of poetry and with history, or if this is something that is a phenomenon that we're seeing in countries that are also re-becoming powers. For example, Turkey positioning itself as a Muslim brother to many countries in Africa, or perhaps Brazil claiming its African roots in culture. Is this something that new, quote-unquote, imperialist powers are sort of, is it like a growing pain in terms of language and in terms of, positioning oneself as an imperial friend to Africans? I think that would be, if you could speak on that and how this this phenomenon opens up questions of how China is looking at itself. Because I would argue that these sorts of, like the bust at SGR, it's not really, I don't know, maybe perhaps it is. I don't really think it's for Kenyans. I don't think a lot of Kenyans know about Zhenghe. And because it's a particular story to the Swahili coast, I don't think it resonates with the political elite of Kenya. So who is that really for? Who are these stories really for? Is it for China? Is it for Chinese people? Or is it for Kenyans?
China is trying, in this pursuit of soft power, which I mentioned, constantly trying to find ideational ways of distinguishing itself from the West and hopefully elevating its image above and beyond that of the West. And so Zhenghe offers an interesting kind of tool in this kit, right? It's here we've got this guy who came here at the head of a very big fleet 600 or so years ago, and he didn't conquer anybody, and all he did was make kind of nice exchanges of gifts, and he went back and he told the people in China what wonderful people you are here in Kenya. And that's the way we Chinese people are. We're just friendly. It's all win-win. You know, we got some little gifts, but we even gave you more gifts than you gave us. And isn't it nice to be in a friendship like that, right? That's part of what's going on, right? Another piece of what's going on is that if you think about it, China has not really found many arguments at a kind of national political level to articulate about what makes it better than the West. The West, for all of its problems, and I am a fierce critic of the West. If people who read my books will find that I'm very free in my criticism of the West, right? However, there are certain things that are associated with the West that are really, really popular. And China hasn't figured out a way to counter them at all. I'll give you a really simple example. This is like a kind of under the radar, low level example. Nobody would think of this as politics on the face of it. But what do Kenyans do on the weekend? What's one of the most popular things for Kenyans to, besides drinking beer? What do they do while they're drinking beer? Watch football. What football teams are they watching? They are completely bound up in European football, especially in British football, right? That's soft power. Nobody's watching anything in China like some Chinese thing. They are completely bound up in English football, completely, maniacally, wearing the blazers and running around and having, it's just unbelievable. The Europeans have propagated their languages everywhere. You know, I go to China, people don't even want to, I speak pretty good Chinese. People don't even want to speak Chinese with me. They want to, like, even people who don't speak good English want to speak English with me, right? But, like, if you go to almost any country in the world today, almost everyone speaks a European language. Literally in almost every country in the world. So people are, like, excited about China sending Confucius institutes around the world that wants to train people to speak Chinese. Good luck. Right? You may spend the next 5,000 years working at that. You had 5,000 years doing other stuff. It's going to take 5,000 years to get over this, right? Because everybody already speaks, in addition to whatever their native language is, a European language. And that is pretty powerful and pretty difficult to overcome. Confucius Institutes won't do it, right? Yeah, you might have a few hundred people who learn to speak Chinese. That'll be great. Maybe it's a few thousand. Right? Everybody in Kenya who's been to school speaks English, right? Everyone, right? So China doesn't really have many vehicles that have enabled it to be able to compete in these terms. And it doesn't, so at the highest level, it doesn't have any obvious political vehicles. So the Westerners are really hypocrites. They've exploited people. They came in and they, did whatever they wanted to do and got whatever they wanted to get. But they also have democratic systems. Democratic systems are popular. People want democracy. I don't have to tell you I like democracy. I proclaimed that earlier. I don't have to tell anybody to like democracy. It turns out that most people, if they have a chance, they would like to have democracy. And that's not because a Westerner told them that. That's because they figured it out themselves. That, we've seen what it's like not to live with democracy. We've seen what it's like not to have any say in who our leaders are or how they govern us. We kind of think it would be nice to try to have the experience of a say in these things. And the people who get an experience of that once want to continue, generally speaking, having that experience. So China, at the level of political systems and ideas, doesn't really know how to compete against that. It certainly doesn't want to promote democracy. It doesn't want it to be defensive about its own system. It doesn't want anybody to tell it what kind of system it should have. But how does it engage the imaginations of people in other places around ideas of politics and of governance, right? It doesn't have a vocabulary. And so Zheng He, on the one hand, is we're different, we're not like them, they did all that stuff, we just came and did all the nice stuff, went back, left you to, minded our own business. By the way, that's not true. Zheng He didn't conquer anybody in the Swahili coast, right? But Zheng He brought the most massive fleet that the world had ever seen before the 20th century, armed to the teeth, and fought battles in places like Sri Lanka and fought battles in various other places in the South, what's called today the South China Sea, and forced people in many places, and I mean the word forced, to pay tribute. The whole purpose, so Ali Khan would not like it if I told the whole story of Zheng He, but the ruler who empowered Zheng He to do this was a man named Yongle, which means eternal happiness, right? And Yongle was a usurper. Early in the Ming Dynasty, I think he was the second ruler. He killed the guy who was supposed to be the ruler and took his place. The guy who was supposed to be the ruler was his half-brother. So Yongle was illegitimate from the start. And one of the ways he devised to overcome his illiteracy was to send out fleets around the world to get people to pay tribute to China. And the tribute was brought home to China so that people would say, look how recognized Yongle is. Everybody around the world thinks Yongle is the greatest person in the world. That was what was going on, right? And as soon as Yongle died, China stopped that stuff. In fact, scrapped the fleet, destroyed the ships, burned the records of the ships. There was no reason anymore. The whole thing was bound up in political prestige and building tribute, generating tribute. So China doesn't really know how to engage around. It wants soft power, it wants influence, it wants prestige, it wants all the good things that come with this, but hasn't figured out how to get this stuff, and it doesn't have a vocabulary. And Yongle is one of, you think about it, Yongle and Confucius are like the two things. They're not controversial. Yongle, a peace ambassador. Confucius, this nice sage who says you can find a few sayings that nobody would offend nobody, and yes, we can talk about this stuff. Well, Confucius is like what, 2,500 years ago, 2,600, something like that, right? Confucius is a long time ago. Yongle was 600 years ago, right? China hasn't come up with a lot of other stuff since then. The stuff what it has come up with since then is, let's just get rich, right? And it turns out that man, what does it go? Cannot live by, People getting rich is fine, but people don't only want to get rich. People want to have other ideas associated with their identity, right? There's an idealistic kind of side, fortunately, to humanity. And so China hasn't figured out how to get beyond the only get rich discourse. And Yongle and Confucius are two of the tools that it's relying on, but doesn't have any real modern pieces to this story.
When I first went to Joburg in '78, there's a whole street of restaurants, Chinese restaurants, under apartheid. And on the maps of Johannesburg, there were Chinese boys' high school, Chinese girls' high school. Nobody could tell me how they got there because the Chinese had been expelled by the apartheid government in the late 40s. There are Chinese families living in Kenya who I've met in '81, '82 onwards, who actually emigrated from apartheid South Africa and are still doing business here. I thought when you were talking about the Chinese farmer agriculturalist in Mozambique, you were going to say, if you don't find Chinese in a country, you won't be able to eat. Because in Accra, Lagos, Jos, Ibadan, places like that from '81, '82 onwards, there were Chinese restaurants, and the menus were printed in Hong Kong. But I mean, the resilience of the Chinese people, regardless of the authoritarian nature of the government in Beijing, the Communist Party, the Kuomintang in Taiwan, if you will, is there, since you speak the language, I don't, there is a certain element, and I grew up in New York where obviously Chinatown just kept expanding and expanding. And I think it's fascinating that the Chinese people themselves seem to have a cultural sense of a resilience to triumph, or to persevere at least. What are your opinions on that?
I think it's possible to make too much of this notion that Chinese people are especially resilient. I don't buy into that. My job is that I teach for a living, right? And I see people from every kind of background. And as it happens, so Chinese people in my country have, and Chinese people according to themselves have a reputation for, great mental capacity and achievement and discipline and love for learning and striving and all of this stuff. The highest achievers in higher education in the United States are the African diaspora. Africans in American universities do better than any other population group. Any other. That's right. Africans perform at a higher rate in American higher education than any other group. I don't think that's because there's something special about Africans, by the way. I don't think there's something special about anybody. I think human beings are human beings. And given a chance, they will all perform. It's how to give people a chance. The thing that is special about Chinese people, and this I think is a cultural, social characteristic of China that is, I think, indeed special, is that the Chinese family has traditionally been very strong. And around the Chinese family, you have a clan, historically you have had a clan structure. And these clan structures and families have enabled the growth of enormous networks of mutual support and aid and commerce around the world. And so you have found historically Chinese groups dispersed in various parts of the world who left China because things were really, truly miserable in China, and who arrived in Guyana or Trinidad or Canada or San Francisco or Kenya or Ghana or you name it. And these structures, they stayed in touch with each other through these structures, and they informed long before anybody dreamed of the internet. They informed each other about where there were opportunities to be had, where there were perils to be avoided, where one could make money, help both for oneself, but also in lending money to others within the clan, et cetera, et cetera. This is a distinctive element of Chinese culture that I think is special. I do not believe that there are special populations. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's the way I see it. And this is based in large part on my experience as someone who teaches, right? So Chinese people are resilient, yeah, but Chinese people have been through a lot, right? The 20th century was incredibly bad. China talks about the century of humiliation. The 20th century after the humiliation was bad, right? They have been through a lot, right? So a lot of what we call resilience is fleeing and recovering and trying to kind of get back on your feet and kind of establish some measure of comfort and prosperity for yourself. And that's admirable, right? But Kenyans want to do that too, and are trying to do that. And people in Uzbekistan are trying to do, there's been horror and bad stuff, and, give people an opportunity, and they'll do their best to seize the opportunity if they can.
This is such a hot subject, and we weren't able to cover absolutely everything. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you.